You have been through some dark places in your mind over your life. What have been some of your darker hours and how did you find the light?
Well, I would say I started contending with the problem of evil very young, 13 or 14. And that's been that was my main motivation of study for 30 years, I guess, something like that. At the end of that 30 years, I became more and more interested in fleshing out the alternative. Like once I became convinced that evil existed, and that was very young, I I always believed that if you could understand something well enough that you could formulate a solution to it. But it turns out that seeing evil and understanding that it exists is less complicated than a technical description of its opposite. Like, what is good? You can say, well, it's not that, for sure. It's not Auschwitz. How about we start there? It's as far from Auschwitz as you can get. It's as far from enjoying being an Auschwitz camp guard as you can get. Okay, well, where are you when you're as far away from that as you could possibly get? What does that mean? And it does have something to do with play, as far as I'm concerned. Like, I think the antithesis of tyranny is play. So that took me a long time to figure out that specifically, you know. And so that was very dark. Like, I spent a lot of time studying the worst behaviors that I could discover abstractly in books, but also in my clinical practice and in my observations of people. And so that's rough. More recently, I was very ill and in a tremendous amount of pain, like that lasted pretty much without any break for 3 years. And what was particularly useful to me then was the strength of my relationships, my immediate relationships, my friendships. Also, the relationships that I had established more broadly with people, you know, because by the time I became ill, I was reasonably well known and people were very supportive when I was having trouble, and that was very helpful. But it's certainly the case that it was the connections I had, particularly with my family, but also with my friends, that were the saving grace. And that's something to know, you know. I mean, it's necessary to bear the burdens of the world on your own shoulders, that's for sure, the burdens of your own existence and whatever other responsibilities you can mount. But that by no means means that you can or should do it alone. And so, you know, you might say, well, welcoming the adversity of life as a redemptive challenge is a task that's beyond the ability of the typical person or even maybe of anyone. But then when you think, well, you're not alone, maybe you're not alone socially, you're not alone familial, maybe you're not alone metaphysically as well. You know, there's an insistence, and I think it's true, there's an insistence, for example, in the Old and the New Testament alike, that the more darkness you're willing to voluntarily encounter, the more likely it is that the spirit of Abraham and the patriarchs will walk with you. And I think that's right. Like, I think it's sort of technically true in that the best parts of yourself make themselves manifest. If you want to think about it that way, the best parts of yourself, whatever that means, make themselves manifest when you're contending actively and voluntarily with the most difficult challenges. Why wouldn't it be that way? And then you could think, well, that's yourself. It's like, well, are the best unrevealed parts of you yourself? Well, no, they're a kind of metaphysical reality. They're not yet manifest. They only exist in potential. They transcend anything you're currently capable of, but they have an existence. You could call that yourself, but like it was Jung's contention, for example, with regards to such terminology, that the reason we use the term self instead of God is because when God was dispensed with, let's say, by the processes Nietzsche described, we just found the same thing deep within the instinctive realm, let's say. We found it at the bottom of the things instead of at the top. It's like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter fundamentally. What matters is whether or not that's a reality. And I think it's the fundamental reality, because I do think that the deeper you delve into things, this is what happens to Moses when he encounters the burning bush. So Moses is just going about his life. He's a shepherd. He's an adult. He has wives. He has children. He has responsibilities. He's left his home and he's established himself. And so things are pretty good for Moses. And then he's out by Mount Horeb in that story, but it's the central mountain of the world. It's the same mountain as Sinai, which is the place where heaven and earth touch. And he sees something that grabs his attention, right? That's the burning bush. And bush is a tree. That's life. That's the tree of life. And the fact that it's on fire that's life exaggerated, because everything that's alive is on fire. And so what calls to Moses is like the spirit of being itself, and it tracks him off the beaten track. And he decides to go investigate. So Moses is everyone who goes off the beaten track to investigate. And so as he investigates, he delves more and more deeply until he starts to understand that he's now walking on sacred ground. So he takes off his shoes, and that's a symbolic reference of identity transformation. He's no longer walking the same path. He no longer has the same identity. He's in a state of flux. And that's when what happens is that he continues to interact with this calling. And Moses asks what it is that's being revealed. And God says, I'm the spirit of being itself. That's basically the answer. I am what I am. It's a more complex utterance than that. I am what I will be. I am what was becoming. It's all of that at the same time. It's the spirit of being that's speaking to him, the spirit of being and becoming. And it tells Moses that he now, because he's delved so deeply into something so compelling, his identity is transformed and he's become the leader who can speak truth to power. And so he allies himself with his brother Aaron, who's the political arm and who can communicate, and he goes back to Egypt to confront the tyrant. And that's an indication of that idea that if you wrestle with life properly, that the spirit of being and becoming walks with you. And it's like, how can that not be true? Because the contrary would be that there would be no growth in challenge. Well, you have to be infinitely nihilistic to believe that.
It's obvious, but it's also just fascinating that hardship is the thing that is that ends up being the catalyst for delving deeply.
It's hardship voluntarily undertaken. Well, and it's crucially true. Look, if you bring someone into therapy, let's say they're afraid of elevators, and you trick them into getting near an elevator, you'll make them worse. Mm-hmm. But if you negotiate with them so that they voluntarily move towards the elevator on their own recognizance, they'll overcome their fear and they become generally braver. But it has to be voluntary.
See, I got to push back and explore with you the question of voluntarily.
Yeah.
Let's look at Nietzsche.
Yeah.
He suffered through several health issues throughout his life. Migraines, eyesight issues, digestive problems, depression with suicidal thoughts. And yet he is one of the greatest minds in the history of humanity. So were these problems that he was suffering arguably involuntarily a feature or a bug?
That's a good question. The same thing happens in the story of Job, because Job is a good man. God himself admits it. And Satan comes along and says to God, I see you're pretty proud of your man there, Job. God says, yeah, he's doing pretty well. And Satan says, I think it's just because things are easy for him. Let me have a crack at him and see what happens. And God says, yeah, I think you're wrong. Do your worst. Right, and that's how people feel when those slings and arrows come at them, let's say like Nietzsche. Well, Job's response to that, now the story is set up so that what befalls Job is actually quite arbitrary, right? These catastrophes that you're describing. The voluntarism in Job is his refusal to despair even in the face of that adversity. And that seems like something like an expression of voluntary free will. He refuses to lose faith. And the way the story ends is that Job gets everything back and more. And, so that's a descent and ascent story. And a cynic might say, well, the ends don't justify the means. And I would say, fair enough, but that's a pretty shallow interpretation of the story. What it indicates instead is that if you're fortunate, because let's not forget that, and you optimize your attitude even in the face of adversity, it's not infrequently the case that your fortunes will reverse. And I've found that in many situations, the journalists whose goal was most malicious in relationship to me, who were most concerned with improving their own, what would you say, fostering their own notoriety and gaining social status at my expense, were the ones who did me the greatest favor. Those were the interviews that went viral. And so that's interesting, because they were definitely the places where the most disaster was at hand. And I felt that in the aftermath. Every time that happened, my whole family was destabilized for like 2 months because it wasn't obvious at all which way the dice were going to roll.
But you leaned into that. So in a sense that there's this kind of a transformation from the involuntary to the voluntary, basically saying, bring it on. That act of bring it on turns the hardship, involuntary hardship, into voluntary hardship.
Well, not necessarily, let's say, but you could say that's your best bet. Well, I'm never going to say that you can transcend all catastrophe with the right attitude, because that's just too much to say. But I could say that in a dire situation, there's always an element of choice. And if you make the right choices, you improve you improve your chances of success to the maximal possible degree.
It might be too much to say, but nevertheless could be true. Viktor Frankl, Marcus Aurelius.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's what the resurrection story proclaims, is that, even under the darkest imaginable circumstances, the fundamental finale is the victory of the good. And that seems to me to be true.